You probably know the story. A teenage runaway who fooled the entire world, flying the globe as a fake airline pilot, posing as a doctor and a lawyer, cashing millions of dollars in bad checks, all before his 21st birthday. Hollywood turned him into a legend, but the greatest con Frank Abagnale ever pulled may not be anywhere in that movie. It may be the movie itself. The story he told goes like this. In the mid-1960s, a 16-year-old named Frank Abagnale watched his parents' marriage collapse and ran away from home in New York with little more than a checkbook, a sharp suit, and an extraordinary gift for charm. The world, he decided, was his for the taking. He claimed he quickly discovered he could talk almost any bank into almost anything. Over the next 5 years, by his own account, he cashed more than $2.5 million in fraudulent checks, bouncing across all 50 states and 26 countries, always charming, always one step ahead. So how does a teenager fool banks across an entire country? By his own account, it came down to small, clever details most people would never notice. He printed his own checks on professional stock and learned to manipulate the strange little magnetic numbers along the bottom, the codes that tell the banking system where a check should go. Scramble them, he claimed, and a worthless check could drift slowly around the country for days before anyone realized it was bad. By then, Frank was already 3 cities away. His masterstroke, the story goes, was a Pan Am pilot's uniform. Dressed as a co-pilot, he said he learned to deadhead, hitching free rides in the cockpit jump seat, flying more than 1 million miles around the world without ever once touching the controls, treated like royalty everywhere he landed. And he didn't stop at pilot. By his own telling, he posed as a pediatrician supervising a hospital ward in Georgia, passed the bar and worked as a state attorney in Louisiana, and even stood at the front of a classroom as a college sociology professor, all before he was old enough to legally drink. The hospital story may be the most jaw-dropping of them all. For nearly a year, Frank claimed he posed as the supervising physician of a pediatric ward in Georgia, in charge of a team of real qualified doctors. He had no medical training whatsoever. His trick, he said, was to hang back and let the eager young interns handle every actual decision, while he nodded along, signed off, and played the calm, experienced boss. It was a con built entirely on confidence and on everyone's assumption that no one would ever dare to fake something so serious. All the while, he said, a determined FBI agent was hunting him across the globe, always arriving just minutes too late. It was a glamorous, impossible game of cat and mouse, a brilliant teenager dancing circles around the most powerful law enforcement agency on Earth. Eventually, the story goes, his luck ran out. He was captured in France and served time in a brutal French prison, then Sweden, before finally being extradited back to the United States to answer for it all. The dream run was over, and even then he claimed he wasn't finished. He said he escaped custody not once but twice, once by slipping out of a taxiing airplane onto the tarmac, and once by convincing his own guards that he was an undercover prison inspector, and simply walking out the front door. After about 5 years behind bars, the legend ends in redemption. The FBI, the story goes, was so impressed that they hired the master forger to help catch other fraudsters. The boy who fooled the world had switched sides, reinventing himself as one of its leading security experts. He wrote a best-selling memoir, and in 2002, Steven Spielberg turned it into a blockbuster film with Leonardo DiCaprio as the charming young conman. Frank Abagnale became a household name, the lovable rogue who beat the system and then went straight. For decades afterward, he toured the world giving sold-out lectures, advising banks, corporations, and the FBI, and earning millions, telling the story of how he had fooled everyone. He was living proof that the cleverest con man could become the ultimate good guy. There was just one problem with this perfect story. When investigators and journalists finally went looking for the hard evidence behind the legend, the court records, the prison files, the victims, the arrests, they kept coming back almost empty-handed. Beginning in the late 1970s and intensifying decades later, reporters began pulling federal court documents, prison records, and old newspaper archives to verify Abagnale's incredible claims. What they found, or rather what they failed to find, was staggering. In 2020, a researcher named Logan published years of that investigation in a book called The Greatest Hoax on Earth. His conclusion was blunt and devastating. Almost none of Frank Abagnale's most famous claims could be supported by the actual record. And Logan was not alone. A journalist named Javier Leyva, the host of an investigative podcast called Pretend, independently combed through the same federal records, court filings, and old newspapers, and reached the very same unsettling conclusion. Again and again, the paper trail told a smaller, stranger, and far sadder story than the dazzling adventure the world had been sold. Two separate investigations, arriving at the same place, were very hard to dismiss. The biggest bombshell came from prison records. They showed that for most of the years Abagnale claimed to be jet-setting around the planet as a Pan Am pilot, he was in fact locked up, sitting in a New York State prison from 1965 to 1968. And the millions in fraudulent checks. Court records tied to his Pan Am case pointed to a fraud of less than $1,500. Investigators calculated that he was only free for around 14 months between the ages of 16 and 21. Nowhere near enough time to cash 17,000 checks across the world. And behind the glamorous myth, investigators say, were real people who got hurt. They pointed in particular to a family who years earlier had taken a struggling young Frank into their home and shown him genuine kindness. The way that chapter really unfolded, researchers argue, looked nothing like the charming, victimless lone wolf caper Abagnale would later describe to laughing audiences. The truth, as so often, was quieter and a great deal more human. He did wear a pilot's uniform. That part appears to be real, but according to investigators, it was for only a few months in 1970, when he was already 22, and largely for TWA, not Pan Am. The million-mile globe-trotting teenage pilot was, they say, almost entirely invented. There was no glamorous, years-long, around-the-world task force chasing a teenage genius across 26 countries. The real pursuit, researchers concluded, was a small-time check fraud case that lasted closer to 3 months. So where did the legend actually come from? According to Logan, the greatest con didn't happen in the 1960s at all. It began around 1977, after Abagnale was paroled, when he started telling a bigger, bolder, better story, on talk shows, on game shows, and on lecture stages. And the world simply believed him. And it all began with television. In 1977, a freshly paroled Abagnale appeared on the popular game show To Tell the Truth, where a celebrity panel tried, and failed, to guess which man was the real imposter. From there came The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson, and a string of national interviews. He was funny, warm, and effortlessly likable, and a captivated public had no reason and no easy way to fact-check a story this good. And that, in the end, is the real twist. Frank Abagnale's true talent was never forging a check or flying a plane. It was telling people exactly the story they wanted to hear and getting them, the public, the publishers, even Hollywood itself, to buy it for 50 years. Psychologists even have a name for part of what happened, the halo effect. When someone is confident, charming, and likable, we instinctively assume they must also be honest and capable. Abagnale grasped something most con artists never do. The easiest mark of all isn't a single nervous bank teller. It's an entire culture, one that desperately wants to believe in the lovable genius who beat the system and got away clean. Abagnale has dismissed the book, saying only that it wasn't worthy of a comment, and some details may always stay disputed. But the evidence suggests his most successful con was never a fake uniform or a bad check. It was convincing the entire world that a small-time forger was the greatest con man who ever lived. If you love stories like this, subscribe.